Hi everyone, welcome here and in the Zoom world. I have the pleasure to introduce you today to Fredrik Gregorius, our speaker for tonight. Fredrik Gregorius is currently a senior associate professor in the history of religion at Linköping University in Sweden. In his doctoral dissertation, which was a while ago, he analyzed how modern Swedish heathens used images from the past to create a context and how the images of all cultures could be used, also awarded by the Royal Swedish Academy of Letters. In the subsequent studies, he did a 2-year fieldwork in an evangelical church in Texas. The purpose was to study the effects of the presidential election in 2012 for the theology of the church, and the focus specifically was on apocalyptical beliefs and spiritual warfare. In the last years, he was part of a research project called Back to Blood, pursuing a future from the Norse past. And he was working on the use of Old Norse religion and ecology within modern heathenism and issues of race and ethnic essentialism. However, the focus of his research generally has been on esoteric movements like Satanism, left-hand path spirituality, modern witchcraft, Afrocentricity, and specifically also the relation between Afrocentricity and esotericism. Fredrik Gregorius has worked as a guest lecturer at the University of Nairobi in Kenya and also at the Université de Abomey-Calavi in Benin. I can't speak French. And also going to Benin offered him an opportunity to engage with the local Vodou religion. Currently, his focus is on the reception and use of African traditions in North American Esotericism, with both an historical and a contemporary focus. The latter, the contemporary focus, is oriented towards New Orleans specifically. The study aims to look into the effects and changes that traditions go through when being adopted in new spiritual, cultural, ethnic, and linguistic communities. And I think that is what he will also be kind of speaking about today. So join me in giving a warm welcome to Fredrik Gregorius.
Thank you. I would like to thank Cassie for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Also, thank you, Jessica, for your kind introduction. So I call this presentation Dreams of Africa, Esoteric Receptions of African Diaspora Religions. And specifically, I'm not going to talk about the African Diaspora religion in themselves, although I will, of course, touch upon it, but rather esoteric reimaginings and how they are being used by contemporary esoteric groups in particularly North America. So the reason for I'm saying this, that this limit my scope, but also I'm not an expert on Latin America or anything like that. So, like I don't speak Portuguese, for example, which I will address with regards to the contemporary Quimbanda communities in New Orleans, for example, where there is a big kind of a difference. I also I primarily see myself as an historian, but there will be, of course, some parts there that will be more on contemporary types of practices, again, primarily in New Orleans. So I hope that some of what I say makes sense and that I don't mispronounce anything too completely. So I wrote, the purpose there is then, how has African diaspora religions been used and integrated into esoteric practices in the global north? I use the term global north because I wanted to avoid the kind of problematic term Western esotericism. For those who are not part of the discussion on esotericism, this has been an ongoing debate for ages about how to use terms like Western esotericism or not. So I'm using the term global north because I'm primarily speaking about North America. So a little bit, so I'm going to show you a picture that includes myself, and this is like the whitest pictures of myself ever. This is from my own initiation into Fa in Benin. This is, so basically this was supposed to be a short presentation about myself, but Jessica's already done that. So why did I choose this picture? Well, again, as I said, the focus in this presentation is not so much the part of the people initiating me, but if there is anyone that is of interest here, it's rather myself. Why did I want to be initiated in Voodoo at all? I mean, as a scholar, of course, I was interested because it was a way of addressing and getting to know a new spiritual tradition that I was interested in. But I was also part of a reception of Voodoo that goes back to that I was not created myself. As you can see, I'm not native to that culture, and it was also a situation where I didn't really understand the words they were saying. Both Fombe and French were foreign to me, so I was very much lost in this. And I think I'm not the only one. Then I didn't really bring into this any kind of practice when I come home, because it was like really the interest I had. It's also the pictures of, I have a lot of pictures of my initiations into Voodoo. I don't have any pictures when I was initiated into Quimbanda, because that was done in New York and they didn't let me take pictures. There was very clearly a big difference in terms of secrecy, the social networks. I didn't feel as alienated in the same sense that I went into the Quimbanda community, because they were kind of people from similar backgrounds. They were North Americans. Few had backgrounds in Latin America, but it was primarily something that was done with people that came from a more traditional esoteric background. And that is kind of what I'm going to focus on today. How is this kind of ideas being integrated into these esoteric communities? Since I know that not everyone here is a scholar of esotericism, I apologize if I use terminology that, but if it feels, just ask me afterwards. But so this is like a short introduction to this. This is what's taken in 2023. This was my second trip to Benin. My primary focus was to be a guest lecturer at the university there. So I'm going to give a little bit of historical background on the reception of Voodoo in North America. And there's going to be a lot of mixing of these traditions, because again, I'm interested in the reception of these traditions. And these receptions very rarely made any distinguish between Yoruba-based traditions, the Voodoo, or anything. It was basically all African religions, and they were all like seen as primitive from a white perspective. The Haitian Revolution in 1791, of course, created the first Black Republic, which created a lot of chaos and fear in particularly North America. That started to lead into images of Voodoo. Most of what I found early writings about Voodoo from North America and England doesn't really discuss the religion at all. It's basically cannibalism. It's a very common theme, is cannibalistic tendencies, and that was basically this kind of dangerous primitive religion that existed in Haiti. Voodoo became more or less a term that was synonymous with black magic and like primitive pagan rites that the white American society had to protect itself. During the American Civil War, of course, during the American Civil War, of course, the term continued to be used and to create, again, this kind of very negative racial stereotypization of African diaspora religions. Coming back to the US Marine occupation in 1915 to 1934, there starts to come some changes. It was still a fairly negative view. Again, Voodoo was more or less illegal in Haiti during this period. There was the Voodoo trials between 1926 and 1930. But as you can see, there started to become this kind of exotification. This is a book called Sea Sodoms, which is this kind of a cynical survey of Haiti, Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico, which is a very good example of this kind of exotification of Haiti and the culture over there. And that was something that reemerged here. Basically, it was both seen as a threat, something that was dangerous, something that had to be fought against, but it was also something that was seen as exotic, something that was an allure, particularly a kind of sexualization of Black bodies and so forth. Most of the material written about African religions and African diaspora religion are quite negative. There's really very little that presents this as a good or proper type of spirituality. Again, barbarism, cannibalism, snake worship is kind of the most common themes you can find. Voodoo then becomes like the imagined other. This is an image of a book called Haiti, the Black Republic, published in 1884 by Spencer St. John, that is a very good example of this. I don't know if anyone read the book, but if you haven't, it's not a good introduction to Voodoo, but if it's a book about the image of Voodoo. It's, again, it's not really describing it as a religion. It's something that's seen as a danger to civilization, basically. So was there no more positive images of Voodoo during this period? One of the first that seems to engage in more positive is to be found actually among esoteric circles. And I think that this had to do, when I'm talking about positive images within esoteric circles, I don't mean that they were positive in the sense that they were not racially coded or not based on this kind of racial images, but they did see a value in it that was not found in other expressions of it. For example, Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, very rarely mentioned anything about African religions of Voodoo. But when she mentioned it, she does so in a way that she sees it again as serpent worship, but in her mind, serpent worship is something that is quite positive. It's just an expression what you find in India with Kundalini and so forth. Another book that is quite early is this book with a very short title, Obeah Simplified, The True Wanga, What It Really Is and How It Is Done, a scientific point, but plain treats it from a popular point of view and divested as far as possible of all technical terms. Very, very short title for this book. It's written by Miguel Jumbo Casansenari. I can't really pronounce it. It's a pseudonym from a Jamaican theosophist. It was written in response to other articles published in Lucifer, like the Theosophical magazine, where it was basically, there was a very aggressive article in Lucifer, which basically described Voodoo as being part of this kind of black magic conspiracy against the white light religions. So this book tried to then explain particularly the Obeah Wanga, these terms, as being something much more positive, that it tried to present it as actually a much more benevolent form of magic than it was usually presented as. It's a very short book and it was quite unknown during the time. It later became popularized again, and it was reprinted due to the fact that I'm going to go into that later, because there is some indication that Aleister Crowley, the British occultist, had read this book, and there's a reference to Obeah and Wanga in Crowley's sacred text, Book of the Law, which I'm going to talk a little bit. I don't think there is any real evidence for it, but there's a reason why the book is still in print. But there was definitely the early stages. Then you do find, and again, this book doesn't talk about gods or spirits. It's basically more about magic as a kind of practice that it's oriented towards. One of the first to address Voodoo and write in, probably one of the most influential writers about Voodoo is the man on this picture, William Seabrook, who was an American journalist who wrote several books about trips to different exotic locations, titles like Jungle Ways, and he was kind of an adventurer. He claimed to have eaten human flesh in one encounter with tribes. Later, he confessed that it wasn't true. So I tried to steal some body parts because he didn't want to lie. So he wanted to find some flesh to eat, actually. Seabrook was a quite special character. He was kind of a tragic figure. He committed suicide in 1945. Also had several drinking problems, to say the least. He often presented very exotic images of other cultures, but they were not necessarily negative. He wasn't necessarily seeing them as being. He wasn't trying to be derogatory, basically, to them. Now I'm doing with two computers. Yes, that's like. But Seabrook was also invested in the occult, and he was also a friend for a while with Aleister Crowley. There's a name that's gonna come back during this lecture. And he wrote this kind of rather sensationalist expose about the astonishing secrets of the devil worshippers' mystic love cult that surprisingly Crowley was not too happy with, to say the least. This article what he wrote about Crowley was also quite revealing of Seabrook himself, because while there was a lot to say about Aleister Crowley and his kind of magical practices, Seabrook definitely put in a lot of himself in the descriptions. He focused a lot on sexual sadism, which sort of overemphasized those aspects, and sensationalists to a large degree that had more to do with Seabrook himself than it necessarily had to do with Aleister Crowley's own system. But he was heavily invested in this kind of esoteric occult milieu. 1929, he published then a book called The Magic Island that was based on his studies or travels in Haiti around a year or something. The book is mostly known today because it popularized the term zombie. And it's a little bit sad in a way that that's kind of what the book is remembered for. He actually only deals with zombies very briefly in the book. It's only a small part of it. The picture we see here on this image is like the image here is from the chapter on zombies. Like that, the image was like the dead was used as labor in the plantation fields. But most of the Magic Island is not about zombies. It's about his experiences with voodoo rituals. And he gets very excited in it. When you read the text, he experiences like rituals with possession, and they're very exotifying. He writes a lot about the image, how the women looks, how dark-skinned they are, and how attractive they are. So he's very obsessed with that. But he's also, apparently, he gets more and more engaged. He writes about that. We're talking about the drummings and possessions. He writes that he also becomes part of it. He wants to become part of it. This quote here from the book is, I think, quite significant. It's sort of not significant, but it is significant, but very sort of typical of Seabrook. Savage rhythms, alcohol and sex, excitement. Yet there was an essential difference, for there was something super added. Perhaps if we mix a little true sacrificial blood in our synthetic cocktails and flavor them prayerfully with holy fire, our nightclubs would be more orgastically successful and become sacred as temples were in the days of Priapus and Aphrodite. Seabrook, basically, you see here, his image of voodoo was not only one where he came as an anthropologist or a journalist that wanted to experience it, but he also saw this kind of, I would argue that Seabrook was called this kind of primitivist movement. He saw this as being that something was lacking in like North American culture that needed to be regained. And he more or less uses voodoo as a mirror image of his own ideals. I mean, I'm not saying that the descriptions of the rituals are, I don't think he lies, he doesn't make them up. I think he exaggerates a lot in them. But it's very clear that his understanding of it is not so much based on actual voodoo practice. It's more based on his images and his ideals about what voodoo should be. That's kind of really the focus of his work. And in his mind, apparently, the world needed to regain a sense of the savage, of the enchanted world where like blood sacrifices could be performed in order to kind of regain a sense of life again. So it's kind of a vitalistic idea that he proposes. But it doesn't really, I mean, voodoo itself just becomes in a way, tool for Seabrook to express his own ideas. It's in a similar way that he kind of used Crowley before, but in this sense, it became more popularized and perhaps more problematic. The legacy of the Magic Island was perhaps not one that Seabrook wanted. Seabrook was not particularly happy with the publication of the book. He didn't like the paintings because he thought they were too racist. And then later, like 1932, came out a movie called White Zombie, which is generally considered to be the first zombie movie. I'm not going to recommend it. It's like an hour and 10 minutes. So, but if you want to see it, you have an hour and 10 minutes that you will never get back. It's very strange. It's like it's supposed. I mean, the movie has everything. It's like blackface and there's like supposedly voodoo rituals, which is like something that apparently I'm not really sure where they got it from. They had scenery that was supposed to be about another movie. The main character is Bela Lugosi, who plays this kind of Svengali-like character that is hypnotizing and creating zombies, and it's called White Zombie because it's basically a love affair that and Bela Lugosi's character makes this white woman into a zombie. And then she's rescued and saved, and all the zombies dies. But it's not. But it is of interest because it's the first zombie movie, and it clearly states that it's based on the Magic Island. But in fact, it's only based on a very short chapter in the book. This, of course, led to several more works about where voodoo started to become like a small trend in American cinema. You have movies like The Devil's Daughter, Wanga, many of them featuring, as you see here, white women in the forefront, often in contrast then to the sort of the black savagery that was sort of expressed during this time. You can also see it, unfortunately, I don't have it on this PowerPoint, but in later publications like Fate magazine, many times when they did about voodoo or Santeria, there was usually like a white woman in the center, and then there was like Black people drumming and creating this. So very typical, like the Wanga scene you see over there. So it is like I would argue that you see here a little bit of a shift. It's no longer only like the danger, that political danger, but now it's kind of this more and more exotification of it. Like voodoo is considered to be something powerful and dangerous, and something that maybe, particularly for esoteric mindset, something that is more sort of authentic, that this is something that has been lacking. There are some other, I don't have time to go over like other contemporary writings in the same way, early writings about voodoo, like Zora Neale Hurston's To Tell My Horse, which is also based on studies in Haiti and Jamaica. It's quite it's a complicated book because it was partially sort of in support of the US occupation. Another book that also came out that was became very influential was my Darren's The Divine Horseman from 1953. That also have a preface by Joseph Campbell that and this is still, if you engage with Voodoo communities, this is still the first book they want you to read. So if you not in Benin, but in like North America, if you go to these kind of Voodoo groups that still exist, that's kind of like, I've been recommended this book so I don't know how many times. Everyone says read The Divine Horseman. That's basically the one that is still seen as the sort of primary source of reference to Voodoo. One thing that occurs in both Hurston, Darren, and also, of course, Seabrook is this image of Voodoo as being this primordial, almost like a non-historical religion that doesn't really exist outside of its kind of anthropological presence. It's like you take the images of the Voodoo rituals, and then they are basically part of this kind of eternal primordial tradition. And this was something that occurs even in like other like writers like Ishmael Reed, who this is a quote from his, this is from Zora Neale Hurston's, a preface to Zora Neale Hurston's book, where he writes, but the greatest accomplishment is in revealing the profound beauty and appealing of a faith older than Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam, a faith that has survived in spite of a horrendously bad reputation and the persecution of its followers. So again, this is the kind of image, even though Ishmael Reed comes from a quite different background, the image is, of course, that these religions are beyond time. They are primordial. They are something that is existing without any history. And that's something that also strikes me when I started to look into this. Many of the kind of books, when you started to read introduction books to Voodoo, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those soon, but they were often like, there's usually some historical background about the transatlantic slave trade, but most of the time, and I'm not talking about academic works, I'm talking about like the more sort of practitioner-oriented works, but most of the time it was very quickly going into this kind of, this is like eternal traditions that have existed forever, more or less. That can be contrasted, of course, to anyone who studies like what's sometimes called Western esotericism or esotericism in the global North. And this is sort of what I'm gonna go into now, which is like, of course, how is this received? So Seabrook starts this kind of trend. I wouldn't say starts, but Seabrook is a very early example of a person connected to esoteric communities that do having this interest in Voodoo, African Diaspora religion, but it doesn't really go into it. It's still not really a community that has this. If we move forward in time, for example, into the 1960s and 1970s, we definitely see that the African diaspora communities are clearly starting to become part of esoteric practices and esoteric communities. One thing, and this is kind of one thing I find interesting, is comparing academic research on esotericism compared to esotericism as a lived practice. Here, this is a biography by James Wasserman called "In the Center of the Fire: A Memoir of the Occult." James Wasserman was a leading member of an organization called the Ordo Templi Orientis. I'm going to explain what it is in a second. This is his memoir. It's actually, the book is written like a little bit of a diary form. So it's sometimes chapters can be this big and sometimes they're quite long. But it is based on diaries from his time of when he became interested in alternative spirituality, kind of New Age movement, and later moved into more kind of esoteric organizations. It doesn't. The reason I mentioned this book is not because it's about African diaspora religion, but that African diaspora religion is very clearly a part of it. It's part of it in the same way as yoga, tantra, ceremonial magic. Like African diaspora religion are part of the same kind of context. He as a practicing as an occultist, definitely moved across these borders, and he does talk a lot about. He meets, for example, his wife in the book, who is a member of Santeria community and a kind of Black Power or more sort of Black Power oriented type of Santeria community. And that's, I'm mentioning this because you can find this not so much maybe in academic studies on esotericism, but you do find it in the primary sources, particularly like memoirs, people discussing the kind of milieu, for example, in New York or California, where they are sort of engaged. So as I was told, not everyone knows all of this. I'm just going to do a little interlude because there's one group that's going to recur a lot when we talk about the reception, and that is the Ordo Templi Orientis, which of course has nothing to do in itself with African-based traditions. But the OTO has actually been quite prominent in the reception of African diaspora religion for esoteric communities. So they, particularly in New Orleans, like the groups I encountered there were very clearly involved with the OTO. There is also some tension. Apart from racial tension, there is also another big problem, and that is the issue of sacrifice. Like many of these religions require blood sacrifices, which is, according to OTO rules, completely forbidden. So that's also something that makes this a bit of a controversial topic. A little bit then, what is the Ordo Templi Orientis? Ordo Templi Orientis is a co-Masonic order. Co-Masonic means that both men and women can join. Founded in Germany in the early 20th century. They basically had this, it's very difficult to know when they were founded. In Germany in the early 1900s, people were basically trading charters and, Masonic charters like Pokemons, So you have a fancy degree, I have one, and you basically, that's kind of how it was. So many of these organizations never existed outside of as a paper. So no one really knows when the OTO actually started to exist as a proper organization. In 1910, Aleister Crowley, the British occultist, joined the organization. It's around here that we actually can see that this starts to become a living organization. In 1925, the OTO, and you see the image of the OTO there, that's their symbol. In 1925, after a kind of controversial conference in Germany, the OTO becomes a Thelemic organization. Thelemic here meaning people who are followers of Aleister Crowley's religious philosophy that is expressed in this book we see here, the Book of the Law, which is an edition from 1938. So the OTO, then, I'm mentioning this because they will return. Today, the OTO is active all over the world, especially in the United States, where they have their main presence is in the United States, but the local chapters and bodies in most countries, Sweden, Germany, Norway, and large parts of South America. Brazil has, I think, the second largest OTO group, which is also, but that's a whole different story. But anyway, looking at this started to become an interest in esoteric communities even outside the OTO. Not because the reason I mention the OTO is that I just happened to encounter them a lot. So that's basically most of them. Clearly, African diaspora religions becomes part of esotericism, part of the kind of esoteric milieu, where they're treated more or less with respect and so forth. One big problem is, of course, the issue of race. And this is something called the Tarot of the Orishas. I just thought it was because this is only one of the cards, but most of the cards, there's if you want to see a really white Oya, you should look into this card because they do, the images are very, very white coded. There's only a few that presented themselves as black. I don't know how influential this tarot card has been or how many people use it, but this also illustrated another problem. For example, around the year 2000, you could see a growing number of books being published by well-known esoteric publishers about Santeria, Voodoo, all of these. Most of this, if you go, for example, you can just do your own online search. Many of the most influential books were all written by white people. They were people who came not from a very different background. They were not from Haiti. They were not from Mexico. They were not from Brazil. They were not part of that kind of community. Many of them could only speak English. Many came from Wiccan communities, that kind of more New Age environment. And that has, of course, that is also something that complicates it. And I will say that a lot of people I encounter in this kind of communities, particularly in New Orleans, are very well aware of this, and they do discuss this quite a lot. But it also means that there is a certain different form of focus. For example, the cultural memory of the transatlantic slave trade is more or less disappearing in favor of possession and feelings of spiritual presence and so forth. today, going into this kind of publishing houses, you can usually find these as it's a small staple of most occult bookstores and so forth. Many times the difference between different traditions are neglected. This is, just to give an example, this is from Llewellyn, one of the biggest publishers. That they have a category of Santeria. And if you look at the books they publish, yes, some are about Santeria. Many are some of Santa Muerte, some are Brujeria, some are Voodoo, Hoodoo, and so forth. So they basically mix them up together as like being one kind of thing. And you can look at other places like one store that I went into before. It was called Dark Star Magic that doesn't have Santeria, but they have Voodoo and are like similar. And then you go in and they have like basically everything from Quimbanda to Candomblé and whatever Voodoo, of course, and Santa Muerte also. So this is kind of like a little bit about how this kind of esoteric publishing houses has been treating this. These books have also been quite criticized. For example, the book here on Santa Muerte was heavily criticized by people working with Santa Muerte because they consider it to be more of a kind of Wiccan approach to it. And you can find a lot of books where Santa Muerte is presented as being this kind of dark goddess figure comparable to the Wiccan flag, the three-folded goddess that Wicca has, so you just place Santa Muerte as that. So that's a little bit. So today it is definitely a part of the esoteric, and it is probably like, and just like with yoga and those other kinds of spiritual practices, it is also there is a lot of discussions both within and outside of these communities, how they relate to the problem, for example, of this. So I'm going to go over and focus a little bit now on New Orleans, and where I sort of see most of this kind of, and New Orleans is a bit more different, and it's a very eclectic spiritual community. This is like images from the Botanica Macumba. I'm going to go into them a little bit more, but New Orleans is like probably, if you want to study these kind of things, it's like the perfect place. Although New Orleans is also one of the most frustrating places in the world, because you never know what's true or not, what is made up and what's fantasy, but that's also part of the appeal, I guess. I've been traveling back and forth in New Orleans since 2012 when I was living in America, and then I've been going back there quite regularly. Gotten to know members of the local esoteric community that's there, previously also the Santa Muerte community. So it is a very good place to, if you want to study this, but also it shows also much more of the complex. For example, it's very easy to dismiss Llewellyn's catalog and say that this is like a kind of cultural appropriation. New Orleans is much more difficult because the relationship is more entangled. Also, the different communities are more entangled with each other. New Orleans is like famous for voodoo. If anyone talks about, if anyone's seen like American Horror Story, this always talk about Marie Laveau and being this voodoo queen and so forth. A lot of that comes from a writer called Robert Tallant in a book published in 1946 called Voodoo in New Orleans. He also wrote later a novel about Marie Laveau, and it was kind of largely responsible for creating this kind of mythology around New Orleans. Voodoo in New Orleans is, it's a read. I was surprised when you actually read a book. It doesn't give any information about voodoo as a practice. It's basically anecdotal stories about mystical voodoo people living in swamps, and there's of course a large chapter on Marie Laveau. It's quite racist, to say the least. It's also one of those books that you see whenever you go to every bookstore in New Orleans has this book. It's kind of the most common book that you can find there. So it's actually a good start to, it doesn't give any information about voodoo. The relationship between voodoo and African diaspora religion is very, very much more complicated. But this book really created a wave about this. And there were rumors about voodoo before. There were rumors. And again, the big problem, however, when dealing with voodoo in New Orleans is what is actually meant. Are we talking about actually people doing some type of spiritual practices? Or is it just a generic term for, people behaving in a way we don't find fit? After the Louisiana Purchase, for example, then the kind of sudden Protestants were quite horrified over the intermingling between different people in Louisiana and New Orleans. So basically, whenever white and black people would meet, they were right that this was a voodoo ceremony, and they were meeting at Congress Square and calling up the devil and so forth. So it's very difficult to know if this actually happened or this was just sort of images. New Orleans has embraced voodoo, the voodoo image at least, and if you go there, you will find, of course, there's a lot of commercialization. Okay, this PowerPoint didn't turn out that good with new. And there's also something like you can buy the New Orleans Voodoo Tarot, made by Sally Glassman. And of course, you can go to Marie Laveau's House of Voodoo or Reverend Zombies, which is basically the same owners, which is they are tourist shops that you can go in there and buy a little magical bag and things like that. There's also the New Orleans Voodoo Museum that I highly recommend. I recommend it because it doesn't say anything about voodoo, but it is an excellent example about how voodoo has been created, how it's been reimagined. It's using a little bit of a horror show vibe to it. So New Orleans voodoo is very complicated. Again, we see here the New Orleans Voodoo Tarot, which is one of the most popular tarots you can find when you go to New Orleans. It's a mixture of orishas and loas and local folklore character from New Orleans. There's also, I also used the book here, Waters of Return, which is a very clearly esoteric interpretation, Dr. Louis Martin. Again, talking about race, I can just add that both of these, creators of this are all white people. And Waters of Return is also integrating a lot of like traditional, particularly esoteric ideas from Crowley, and to a degree, one of Crowley's students, Kenneth Grant. And this is sort of, Waters of Return is also an example where there's an attempt to create a kind of New Orleans voodoo, because what it's meant with New Orleans voodoo is very vague. It's not really. Sometimes people say it's more like hoodoo. It's a practice. Is it not? Does it actually exist? It's kind of like vampires in New Orleans. You're not really sure what is mythology and what is actually based on actual folkloric practices. One of the most famous people, and also a very good example of how voodoo and esotericism is being used as a kind of is Sally Ann Glassman. She runs the New Orleans Healing Center and is also the creator of the New Orleans Voodoo Tarot that I showed you before. Her book, Voodoo Visions, was published in the year 2000, and it's a very good example of how voodoo, she mixes like the places, the loas, the tree of life, the Kabbalistic tree of life, and she integrates a lot of this from mixing, particularly, again, Thelemic ideas with voodoo and sort of trying to place voodoo spirits in the Kabbalistic tree of life. She still has a lot of respect for most in most local communities in New Orleans. She has been criticized by some practitioners because she's initiated in Haiti, and she apparently do attempt to do a lot of like social work. From what I know, she's been criticized because she runs like a vegan voodoo house because they don't do animal sacrifices. So that's been something that many people have been kind of angry with her over. But she's been quite influential. The other big trend that's kind of really starting to, which I think is like, and this is kind of where I think is my focus, what I find interesting, is the development of Quimbanda in New Orleans. So there is a growing popularity in Quimbanda, and here we see a clear interaction between European, South American, and African forms of magic. So Quimbanda has started to emerge as probably one of the most significant spiritual trends in like the more organized esoteric communities in New Orleans. I'm not gonna go over like the background because I'm not an expert on that, but basically Quimbanda is a Brazilian tradition. It comes from a healer or magician, and again developed out of African Diaspora traditions. This is like the second ancestor veneration, Kardecian spiritism, and so forth. Quimbanda is focusing, particularly the ones we see in North America, with spirits that are considered to be lower or dangerous or more African, that sort of becomes a mirror image of another spiritual tradition called Umbanda. It sort of develops in the 1970s and continued to. And when I talked to like people, like a friend of mine who did work on Candomblé, he said that the idea of Quimbanda as a separate tradition was a little bit difficult. That many times they were more intermingled with each other. So you could really not say that this is a Quimbanda house. But in New Orleans and in North America, it's definitely seen as a separate tradition. It's not something that's considered to be their own tradition. So why is Quimbanda becoming popularized? One significant person for this is a man called Nicolai de Matos Friswold, who we see in this picture here. He is Brazilian Norwegian. He lives currently in Brazil. He has a long history of being a member of several different esoteric groups. He was a member for a while in the OTO in Norway. He's also a member of a more obscure witchcraft tradition called the Clan of Tubal Khan, which is based on the writings of a man called Robert Cochrane, who lived in England. He committed suicide in the 1960s. Friswold started to publish works on Quimbanda. He's also published books on Ifa. He's published on Palamayombe, and also like Nordic rune magic. And so it's basically published on different traditions. But he started to publish works on Quimbanda for particularly esoteric publishers like Scarlet Imprint, which is a British publishing house, and Hadean Press, which is also a British publishing house. Friswold basically writes from a more like esoteric perspective. He uses this, like the references like very clearly for an audience that are into ceremonial magic, that have a background probably in things like witchcraft or OTO and such groups, which makes his books in that way kind of accessible. They're still sort of, I have never heard anyone saying that they're necessarily particularly wrong, but they're clearly sort of oriented to a specific audience. Following like Friswold, but also the kind of groups that you kind of encounter, in particular in New Orleans, there is also a presentation that there are different types of Quimbanda. See that time's running away a little. Okay, not okay. It's are sort of presented as being different ways of approaching and how they relate to, for example, Umbanda and how they relate to African traditions. So the three that the house I'm initiated into, they talk about this Quimbanda de Angola, Quimbanda Congo, and Quimbanda Luciferiano. They are members of the group is Quimbanda de Angola, which is but also have a lineage to Quimbanda Congo, while Quimbanda Luciferiano is being interpreted as being Black Umbanda. So they basically see it as being less. And it's also, ironically, a little bit almost of a satanic panic myth about Quimbanda Luciferiano, that they are doing dark rituals, like more dark rituals than apparently ordinary Quimbandas do. A central part of this is of course a cult around this kind of like darker or sort of more sort of fiery spirits, as it's usually considered to is named Eshu and Pompagira. Eshu is related to the term, Eshu is similar to the Yoruba Eshu, which is, again, they have no real comparisons. So that was, so it's not Eshu or Elegua, but this is like a generic name for several like families of spirits. And Pompagira is Kimbudu word again, that is meaning crossroads, I think. This is this is like the Eshu Moshego, and this is Maria de Padilla. Most of the time you see these images, again, they are quite white. They are, even though they're considered to be more African and more in that sense dangerous. Most of these spirits are considered to be people who were maybe everything from like poisoners, sorcerers, prostitutes, people living outside social norms and so forth. And every person becomes initiated, and even before your initiation, you have your own personal Eshu and your own personal Pompagira that you supposedly work with as kind of like your primary source of spiritual interaction. So when you become baptized and later initiate, you're supposed to develop a relationship with your Eshu. Primarily your Eshu if you're a man or male identified, and your Pompagira if you're a female or female identified in some way. So that is sort of, and you should ask them. It's a quite living relationship. You have this kind of, you drink with them, you go out. It's a very sort of it's a kind of fun tradition, a little bloody. granted. There's a lot of sacrifices, but you have to deal with that. Sometimes there's also some type of spiritual hierarchies. I've seen different types of spiritual hierarchies. One here is that you have on the top something called mayoral. Sometimes mayoral is identified with Eshimor or Baphomet, which we see here, and sometimes Baphomet or Eshimor or Eshibelzebub is considered to be its own force. There is, again, different types, but it usually is like one principle over, and then you have three kind of more, usually quite satanic creatures below, like Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Astaroth or Pompagira, the Inferno. Not going to be able to go over all of this in detail, just sort of giving a kind of overview of this. But basically, if you are initiated into Eshimor or Eshimor Shego, for example, he is your primary source of anything. So he will be the head of your house or your kind of temple. And the kind of the house you're initiated in will, of course, have their sort of spirits that are on top. And as I was going to talk about practice, like, again, there is also 7 kingdoms that are sort of existing here on Earth. So whenever you go back in and out, so for example, when you go out drinking, you happen to be in the kingdom of Lyra or the harp, which is like partying and like more fun stuff in life. And if you go to a cemetery, you will be in of course, the kingdom of the kingdom of Kalunga, the cemetery, and so forth. So basically, often these kind of kingdoms will mix themselves with each other. I took this. This is I found this. I didn't want to take any pictures of it, not publicly available because of respect for. But this is a publicly available. This is from what you're supposed to do whenever you enter a cemetery. That you're supposed to, particularly if you're going to do some magical work there. You take coin and a cigarette and you place it up if you want to be a longer time. That was what I was taught. And then when I leave the cemetery, I should throw coins over my head, which I did in Malmö, which wasn't really smart because there was people walking behind me and so I was kind of hitting them with. But you became a little bit sort of paranoid, just kind of feel, should I go into cemetery? I should have a cigarette with me. It's like kind of goes into kind of bodily memory that you still have that. So this most of the time you have crossroads and so forth. So it's a very kind of, if you actually get into it, and particularly in New Orleans, the people I encountered there, to them this is very much a living thing. They could point out immediately, oh, this is like the kingdom of the cemetery. This is also the cross, because there's usually a cross in cemetery. There's a mixture between the different kingdoms and so forth. There is also like basic practice. Eshon Popagira is considered to reflect both good and bad sides of a person. This, I guess, is very like common in North America. You still have this kind of, it's about self-development, and it's not, for example, healing is not a big part of the people I'm encountered in North America. They were not really interested in healing. They were interested more in just getting like the spirits, getting possession, getting experiences of these Eshus and Pompagiras. You sing songs, you draw the sigils and things like that, often usually offering cigars or cigarillos and food. Another central part is of course possession. That this is something that's repeated, that Quimbanda is a cult of possession. And a lot of training with initiation is about becoming possessed. It can be both total and mixed. Total possession is basically that you don't know what you're doing. Mixed is that you kind of feel the spirit in you. And this is kind of where I sort of, again, I found it interesting. Again, comparing my experiences in Benin with those in New York and New Orleans. Like, for example, in Benin, possessions would be quite undramatic. Someone became possessed, and that was suddenly they started speaking another voice, or someone say, okay, they are possessed now, so leave them alone, or you just wait until they are finished, and almost like someone speaking in tongues that you can find. It was not particularly dramatic. In the kind of Quimbanda communities in North America, this is much more dramatic, and it's much more essential part of the practice. And I think in one way, one of the reasons for this is, of course, that this is probably what is appealing to people the most. This is what draws people to these traditions. They want to experience. Again, going back to Seabrook is very interested in possession. He wants to see people change their facial expressions. He wants to see, the eyes turning white and things like that. In the same way, and I think this has to do, so why is this possession so interesting? Why do you have to go Brazilian traditions to experience this? I think one reason is that there is a sense in some esoteric communities that traditional ceremonial magic doesn't really give that effect. It's not something, it's usually quite intellectual. So you want to liberate yourself from that. You want to have something that is clearly more ecstatic, something that's more authentic. That, of course, also creates a problem of exotification, that this image of that these traditions are not historically based, that they are much more sort of, I wouldn't say primitive, but in a sense imagined as being that they are sort of something that can express an authentic aspect of culture. In the same way, I guess, with folklorists in the early 19th century, or like early 20th century, we go out in the countryside in England and try to find folk traditions and claim that these were real pagan traditions that could revitalize the culture they lived in. How has the development in the United States seen? Originally, Quimbanda was done in Brazil. Some individuals were initiated in Quimbanda in New Orleans in the late 1980s, were initiated in Quimbanda and lived in New Orleans in the late 1980s, but it was not a very particularly big thing. It seems to be the biggest thing that happens was after Friswold's works were done and people who were primarily through Friswold initiated in his lineage and came to North America. One of the groups that I found a lot of this was particularly the local body in New Orleans, and this is outside, which is like called Alambrados. I have these two gentlemen on the picture there, which are also members of a Quimbanda-oriented black metal band in New Orleans, very, very good friends of mine. So, and this is kind of like one thing that I kind of noticed, even though they were very clear, everyone was very clear that the OTO has nothing to do with Quimbanda. That was a very big thing that they wanted to say. OTO has nothing to do with Quimbanda, Santeria, Voodoo, or anything, because that's not something that the OTO approve of. Again, the OTO is not, there is certain things that the OTO would not agree on. But I was kind of wondering, why does this happen? Because it was very clearly, you can also see this is, I thought this was kind of like a good example of the impact of Quimbanda in the OTO. You see here, this is from the Botanica Macumba, which is have like a temple on the what do you call it when bands play? You know, it's training room for bands. I don't know. But and downstairs they have the Botanica. But this is like upstairs they have this is seen. It's Thelema, which is of course references to Thelema. This is like a door painted with Quimbanda sigils. There is actually quite a good reason for. So one thing that was interesting was also how different like sacred books are being reinterpreted. So one thing that I've noticed that is very common that you find particularly in North America with people in the OTO is that they make a reference to a quote from the Book of the Law, that is Crowley's divine text that people should follow, which says also the mantras and the spells, the obeah and the wanga, the work of the wand and the work of the sword, these he shall learn and teach. The reason why this was important is because this gives a kind of tradition, this gives a legitimization why African traditions need to be integrated into Thelema. And there were people who I talked to said that like the African traditions are like the third part that would complete Thelema, that like Thelema is ceremonial magic, and then it has yoga and like in Eastern traditions, like, but the African diaspora religion would be what kind of would revitalize Thelema, which makes it more magical again. In OTO, there was in New Orleans, there was a lot of strong impact, particularly from Quimbanda. When I say half of the membership, I don't mean that they were initiated, because initiations can be quite expensive, but most definitely had their own issues and pompagirs given to them by their tata. It was also quite clear that they read Crowley from a less psychological perspective. They were quite critical of the psychological interpretations of Crowley. That many modern Thelemites tend to view magic as a psychological, like doing magic is something that happens within you, while it was very clear in New Orleans that they were more saw even the Thelemic magic as being something raising spirits and actually engaging with extra manifestations of spirits that didn't exist only within you. And I thought that was kind of fun too. And of course, also you have the cultural expressions, primarily the band Mehenet, which we see here, which is a black metal band from New Orleans that have done a lot of their early, I think, records were very focused on Quimbanda, with basically black metal songs about Eshus and Pompagiras. And when you went to the shows, they would scream out Salve Eshu, Salve Pompagira, but in a kind of growling black metal voice. Not all the audience understood it, to be fair, but it's kind of it also shows that they kind of also, so you had musical tradition originally originating in Norway, and that somehow made it to New Orleans, that started to use. And if you actually listen to Mehanet, they do use sometimes like Brazilian rhythms in the same way, similar, I guess, in a way that Sepultura does, but they are much more, they're darker than Sepultura. So why does Quimbanda seems to be like the new big thing happening in the esoteric receptions of African diaspora religion? One is, of course, the promise of a direct interaction with Eshus and Popayiras. They're described as being friends. They're people that you want to hang out with, or spirits you want to hang out with. You develop a relationship with them. And I think in North America, it's much more focused on this relationship than material gains. It's not really important if you make money from the rituals. It's more, do you want to hang out with your Eshu and Pompayira? You want to, go out with them. And as I said before, also the language about becoming a better person, learning about yourself, and all of that is quite common when talking to people. Also, to somehow start to wrap it out, comparing it to Voodoo, there's a lot of advantages with Quimbanda. One, it's easy to become initiated. You don't have to go to Haiti, which has been a big problem. And I think that despite Voodoo being the most famous, most of the people in esoteric communities that I met, very few have been initiated in Voodoo. Most have been initiated in Santeria, or now more and more Quimbanda, because these are traditions that you can become initiated in the United States. So you don't need to travel to Haiti. Another thing I also think is that there is no direct taboos in Quimbanda. And that's a big thing. I think both in Santeria and in Voodoo, and there's often the idea of taboos, for example. When you become initiated into or born into, we get a certain god or Orisha as a god parent, you're not allowed to eat certain foods. There are certain things you're not. It's basically a lot of regulations around how you can act. You don't really find that in Quimbanda, which I think also is one thing that popularized it. Images are more familiar. The Baphomet, the satanic images are also quite appealing to people. And it's kind of like, I guess we can't go into the whole problem of people being bored with conventional Satanism, but I think that people who like that feel more, it's one thing to call on the devil and squeeze like a Church of Satan thing saying, "Hail Satan." It's another thing to actually talk to the devil. It's much more fun to talk to the devil. So I think that people are more happy with that. Easy to connect to Yoruba-based religions that was already established. There was also something a lot of the people, and also the house that was initiated, they recommended, many people were also involved. They were not involved in candomblé, which surprised me a little bit. There was Santeria or Lukumi that was their focus. So you had a Cuban tradition that was integrated with a Brazilian. But it was basically, the argument was that you should have a proper religion that should sort of create a kind of moral framework that you should work with. But that's sort of, to summarize it off, Quimbanda, I used Quimbanda here as an example because it's the one I found most vibrant, and where I think most changes are happening today in this kind of new communities. Seeing, however, there will be new developments. If you look, for example, at a country like Brazil, which I'm definitely not expert on, but historically, like many of these traditions come from people who have a Catholic background. Now you have a situation where people have, for example, Protestant or Jewish background, or maybe have a completely secular background. Many are often involved in Western traditions like witchcraft or Thelema. Many, in Quimbanda communities, there's usually people who are part of something called the sorcery community, which is people who are not into Wicca, but they're into different types of so-called traditional witchcraft, which is just as made up as Wicca, but a little bit darker. There's more focus on interaction with the spirits and healing. There's much more interest in just getting to know the spirits. Even though terms like healing, getting medicine is still used, it's not really the main focus. Most people will go to the doctor, and there is not really that interest in healing aspect of it. One thing I did find interesting also is that these people don't speak Portuguese. They are not Portuguese speakers. So that means, for example, morcego only means bat, but it sounds more magical if you don't know Portuguese. And morcego sounds a little more mystical. And that's also something I kind of contemplated myself, is that these people don't come from this background. So Portuguese becomes like a magical language in a way, in the same way that you can see French would become for early Voodoo initiations, or Spanish mixed with Yoruba in more Santeria and things like that. So that's the linguistic division is quite interesting. That it would be a very big difference. That's the same thing I noticed with, for example, when I did studies on like heathens in North America, where they would sing Swedish songs that were like very clearly like maybe not, they had nothing to do with religion. They were just very, sometimes even lullabies, and they would say, I feel this is like a Nordic spirit coming over me. One thing so this is just a side note, I'm sorry, but you can see that, for example, there's a band called Heilung, which has a song which is basically just repetition of the runic alphabet. It's like ABC, but like as you can see, people who don't know that we say, yeah, this is like really cool. This is really dark. And in a sense, that becomes similar here. There is a large focus on learning Portuguese. But it's also, this is often more middle class, more academic. Many people were anthropologists. Many people had PhDs. Many people had not, and there was also something that made them very well aware of the problematic aspect of the connection to the transatlantic slave trade, cultural appropriation. There was something which I also imagine led to more kind of conservative approach. Many felt that they couldn't change anything. It was not up to them. They couldn't. And I think that's also based on the experience, what I mentioned before, how these traditions were used by, for example, esoteric publishers in the early 2000s. So I'm going to wrap it up now, because I see that you should have told me that. I was running over time. But so that's also something like, for example, there was very clearly more focus on learning history, anthropological books. A lot of focus was on Congo. I'm just going to end also saying that one thing, it was very political. Like this community was very, very political. It was something that surprised me a lot. Very progressive, like LGBTQ. They were openly anti-fascist. They were talking a lot. I mean, if spells work, Trump have big problems. I mean, because they were not particularly happy with Trump being elected. But there was also something I found that it was so very openly political. I didn't expect it. I'm not sure that's also something you'll find all over. So my conclusion is that I think that this is an interesting example of how this tradition will develop and become more and more changed the more it develops in North America. And it will be interesting to see both the integration, but also like the separation from the Brazilian tradition. Now I'm done.